I never imagined the worst day of my life would start with a sunrise that beautiful. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, the kind of dawn that felt like a promise. Except that promise was a lie. It was my wife, Elena, who woke me up that morning, shaking my shoulder gently as smoke filled our bedroom. "There's a fire," she said, her voice calm but urgent, her face pale in the flickering glow. My brain, still groggy from sleep, didn't register her words immediately. But then I smelled it, burning wood, acrid and sharp. The next few minutes were a blur. Grabbing what little we could, rushing down the stairs as the heat closed in. The house we had built together, brick by brick, memory by memory, was engulfed in flames by the time the firefighters arrived. We stood outside, watching it crumble, holding on to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. I thought the worst part of the day was losing everything we owned. I was wrong. Later, as we stood shivering in the early morning chill, Elena's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled, a genuine, radiant smile I hadn't seen in months. "It's my friend Mark," she said, her voice brighter than it had been all day. "He's offering to let us stay with him until we figure things out." Mark. I vaguely remembered him as a name from her past, an old college buddy she used to mention with a little too much fondness. But I was in no position to argue. We had nowhere else to go, and the idea of a warm bed was too tempting to resist. "Fine," I muttered. "Call him." By the afternoon, we were pulling up to Mark's house, a sprawling, modern place in the suburbs, with wide windows and a driveway big enough for 3 cars. Mark greeted us at the door with open arms and a wide smile. He looked exactly as I'd imagined, tall, fit, and confident, with that easy charm that made me immediately dislike him. But I bit my tongue. He was doing us a favor, after all. Elena seemed happy, too happy for someone who had just lost everything. She laughed at Mark's jokes, teased him about his decor choices, and didn't seem to notice, or care, that I was barely holding it together. I told myself she was just trying to make the best of a bad situation, but a nagging voice in the back of my head whispered otherwise. Over the next few days, as I struggled to come to terms with the loss of our home, Elena seemed to thrive. She spent her mornings chatting with Mark over coffee, her afternoons shopping for essentials, and her evenings disappearing into the guest room next door. I told myself it was grief, that she was coping in her own way. But the cracks in our marriage, once hairline fractures, were beginning to widen. And then, one night, everything changed. I had been lying awake, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of the tiny guest room we now called home. Through the thin wall, I heard voices, Elena's and Mark's, low and murmured, like a secret they were trying to keep from the world. I strained to hear, catching only fragments. Laughter. Her voice softening in a way that made my stomach twist. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. But then I heard her laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard in months. Carefree. Joyful. Happy. That's when I got up. I moved quietly, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor, and stopped outside the door to Mark's room. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside without being noticed. And what I saw shattered whatever illusions I had left about our marriage. There they were on his bed, her head thrown back in laughter, his hand resting on her thigh. It was casual, almost innocent, except that nothing about it felt innocent. Not the way he looked at her, like she was his. Not the way she smiled at him, like I didn't exist. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, a justification. But there was none. Elena was happy. And I was nothing more than an afterthought. I turned and walked away, the floor creaking under my weight. They didn't notice. They didn't care. And that's when I realized, I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was cold. Cold in a way I'd never been before. They had taken everything from me. And now it was my turn. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes I saw them, Elena and Mark, together in that room, their laughter still echoing in my ears. The house fire had been bad enough, but this This felt like someone had reached into my chest and crushed my heart with their bare hands. By the time dawn broke, I had decided to confront Elena. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I couldn't let this slide. She owed me an explanation, some kind of truth, even if it wasn't what I wanted to hear. When I found her the next morning, she was in the kitchen with Mark, making pancakes like nothing had happened. She laughed at something he said, flipping a pancake with a practiced ease, and I felt my stomach churn. Mark noticed me first, his grin fading as his eyes met mine. "Morning," he said, his voice a little too casual. Elena turned, a bright smile on her face that faltered when she saw me. "Hey, you're up early," she said. "Didn't you sleep well?" I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I forced a tight smile. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Her expression softened, and she set the spatula down, walking over to me. "I get it," she said, placing a hand on my arm. "We've been through so much, but we'll get through this together, okay?" Her touch burned. I wanted to pull away, but I didn't. "Not yet." "Yeah," I said. "Together." She smiled, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, and returned to the stove. I watched her, watched them, my mind racing. The way she tilted her head when Mark spoke, the way she laughed at his jokes. It was like watching a stranger. The Elena I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I needed proof. That night, I stayed awake again, listening. Waiting. And just as I'd suspected, the whispers started. Low voices through the thin wall, followed by footsteps and the sound of a door quietly clicking shut. I waited a few minutes, long enough for the adrenaline to build, then got up and crept to their room. The door was closed this time, but the light spilling out from under it told me everything I needed to know. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I debated what to do. Burst in and confront them? Leave and pretend I hadn't seen anything? Or something else entirely? Instead, I walked away. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed more. Something definitive. Something they couldn't deny. I went back to the guest room, grabbed my phone, and opened the voice recording app. If this was how it was going to be, I was going to catch them red-handed. The next night, I was ready. I set the phone to record and left it near their door, hidden in the shadows where it wouldn't be noticed. Then I waited. It didn't take long. The voices started again, soft and conspiratorial, growing louder as the minutes passed. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. When I retrieved the phone the next morning, my hands were shaking. I locked the door to the guest room, sat on the edge of the bed, and hit play. Their voices came through clear, unmistakable. "You think he suspects anything?" Mark's voice asked, laced with amusement. "No," Elena replied, laughing softly. "He's so caught up in everything with the house, he doesn't even notice." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stopped the recording, unable to listen any further. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the way they talked about me, like I was some clueless fool, blind to what was happening right in front of me. But I wasn't blind anymore. That night, Elena came to bed late. I pretended to be asleep as she slid under the covers, her movements slow and careful, like she didn't want to wake me. I waited until her breathing evened out, then slipped out of bed and went to the bathroom. I stared at myself in the mirror, my reflection a mix of anger, pain, and something darker. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. If they thought I was clueless, I'd let them. If they thought they could walk all over me, I'd let them think that too. But I wasn't going to let this go. Not by a long shot. I stepped out of the bathroom, glancing at the closed door to the guest room next to ours. My mind was already racing, formulating a plan. If they wanted to play games, I'd play too. Only this time, I'd make the rules. I woke the next morning with a strange sense of calm, a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The anger was still there, burning just under the surface, but now it had direction. I wasn't going to confront Elena or Mark, not yet. not until I had everything I needed to make them regret every decision that brought them to this moment. At breakfast, Elena was chipper again, humming to herself as she poured coffee and flipped through her phone. Mark had already left for work, leaving the house quieter than usual. I sat across from her, watching her carefully, noting every detail. The way her lips curved into a smile when she read a message. The way she glanced at the door, like she was waiting for him to walk back in. "Big plans today?" I asked casually, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled, then quickly smiled. "Not really. Just errands, maybe some calls to the insurance company." "You?" I shrugged. "Thought I'd look into some leads for the house. See if we can find a temporary place until the rebuild starts." "That's a great idea," she said, her tone bright and supportive. If she felt any guilt about what she'd been doing, she hid it well. But I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. Later that morning, I left the house, pretending to go house hunting. In reality, I drove to a nearby electronics store. I walked out half an hour later with a small, high-quality spy camera, discreet, easy to hide, and exactly what I needed. Back at the house, I installed it in Mark's bedroom while Elena was out running errands. It was hidden well, tucked into the corner of a bookshelf with a perfect view of the bed. I hated myself for stooping to this level, but I needed undeniable proof. Proof I could use to expose them both. That evening, Mark came home late, carrying takeout and flashing that smug smile of his. "Brought enough for 3, he said, holding up the bags like he was some kind of hero. I wanted to punch him right then and there, but I forced a smile. "Thanks. Smells good." We ate in the living room, the three of us pretending everything was normal. Elena laughed at his jokes, leaning a little too close to him, her hand brushing his arm now and then. My stomach churned, but I said nothing. I needed them to keep thinking I was oblivious. After dinner, Mark suggested a movie. Elena eagerly agreed, and I had no choice but to sit there, trapped between them, as they laughed and whispered throughout the film. It was torture, but I endured it. Every minute that passed brought me closer to what I needed. That night, as they whispered in Mark's room again, I waited. My phone buzzed with a notification from the camera, letting me know it was recording. I didn't check it immediately. I didn't need to. I already knew what I'd see. The next morning, after Elena left for a yoga class, I retrieved the footage. My hands trembled as I opened the app and hit play. The camera didn't miss a thing. They were laughing, joking about how he'll never figure it out. Mark pulled her onto the bed, his hands on her waist, and she didn't resist. I watched for as long as I could stomach it, then closed the app and set the phone down. It was worse than I'd imagined, not just because of what they were doing, but because of how happy they looked. Like I was a punchline in their private joke. But now, I had the proof I needed. The question was, what was I going to do with it? That evening, I pretended to be in good spirits, even cracking a few jokes at dinner. Elena seemed relieved, smiling at me like everything was back to normal. Mark, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, glancing at me now and then like he was trying to figure me out. "You okay?" Elena asked him at one point. "Yeah," he said quickly, forcing a grin. "Just tired." I didn't say anything, just smiled to myself. Let him be suspicious. It wouldn't matter soon enough. Over the next few days, I started planting seeds of my own. Subtle things, little changes in routine that threw them off balance. I stayed up later than usual, claiming I couldn't sleep. I rearranged furniture in the guest room, making it look like I'd been searching for something. I left my laptop open on the kitchen counter, with tabs open to legal forums and divorce lawyers. I wanted them to feel the pressure, to start questioning what I knew and how much. It didn't take long for cracks to appear. Elena became more nervous, her smiles less frequent. Mark started avoiding me altogether, staying out late and retreating to his room as soon as he got home. Good. Let them squirm. One night, as Elena was getting ready for bed, I casually mentioned a funny story I'd read online. This guy found out his wife was cheating on him. I said, keeping my tone light. But instead of confronting her, he waited and gathered evidence. Then he exposed her in the most public way possible. Elena froze, her toothbrush halfway to her mouth. "That's awful," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Why would someone do that?" I shrugged. "Guess he wanted to make sure she couldn't deny it. Some people just want the truth to come out, no matter the cost." She didn't respond, but her hands were shaking as she finished brushing her teeth. I went to bed that night with a smile on my face. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait. The days that followed were electric with tension. Every glance from Elena felt like a question she was too afraid to ask. Mark's behavior shifted too, more guarded, more careful. I could see the paranoia starting to creep into their lives, and it thrilled me. I kept pushing them, bit by bit, watching as the cracks grew wider. One evening, Elena brought up the idea of moving out of Mark's house. "I think we should start looking for a place," she said, stirring her tea with a forced calmness. "I don't want to overstay our welcome." Mark, sitting across the room, shot her a quick glance, but he stayed quiet. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to mull it over. "That's a good idea," I said, keeping my tone light. "But it might take a while to find something. We don't exactly have the funds for a rush move." Elena nodded, her expression tight. "Maybe we can stay in a hotel for a bit. Just until something opens up." "Why the rush?" I asked, locking eyes with her. "Mark doesn't mind us being here. Right, Mark?" Mark's smile was thin and strained. "Of course not. You guys are welcome as long as you need." Elena's knuckles whitened as she gripped her mug. "Still," she said, not looking at either of us, "I think it's time we figure things out." Her voice was steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't suggesting we leave because of me, she was panicking about how much I might know. That night, I reviewed the latest footage from the camera in Mark's room. Their conversations had grown more hushed, their meetings shorter, but they couldn't resist each other for long. "I think he knows something," Elena said, her voice low but urgent. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're just being paranoid. If he knew, don't you think he'd say something by now?" "Maybe he's waiting," Elena replied, pacing the room. "He's been acting so weird lately. And that story he told me about the guy who exposed his wife? It felt like a warning." Mark laughed, but it was forced. "You're overthinking this." "I don't think I am," she shot back. "We need to be careful." Careful wasn't going to save them. The next day, I made a point to be distant. I spent hours at the library, claiming I was looking for work, though I was really plotting my next move. By the time I got home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I found them in the kitchen, sitting at the table, their conversation halting as soon as I walked in. Elena looked up, her face pale, while Mark focused on his coffee mug like it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries. "Hey," I said, setting my bag down. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Elena said quickly. "Just talking about the house." "Uh-huh," I replied, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. I leaned against the counter, studying them both. "Well, if you two have a plan, let me know. I'm all ears." Elena's smile was brittle. "Of course. We'll figure it out together." Her words felt hollow, a performance for my benefit. I played along, but inside, I was seething. They thought they could outsmart me, that I'd let this slide. But the game wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, I uploaded the recordings from Mark's room to a secure drive. Every word, every laugh, every whispered promise, it was all there, waiting. I wasn't ready to unleash it yet, but knowing I had the evidence gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction. As I stared at the screen, an idea began to take shape. If I wanted to truly destroy them, I couldn't just expose their affair. I had to make them feel the same pain they'd inflicted on me, slowly, methodically, until there was nothing left. The next morning, I started phase 2. I made a point of being overly affectionate with Elena, catching her off guard with compliments and small gestures. At breakfast, I brought her coffee just the way she liked it and kissed her on the cheek. She stiffened at first, then forced a smile. Thanks, she said, glancing at Mark, who was eating his cereal in stony silence. You've been working so hard, I said, my tone dripping with sincerity. I don't know what I'd do without you. Elena's cheeks flushed, but her eyes darted nervously to Mark. That's sweet of you to say. Mark got up abruptly, muttering something about needing to get ready for work. As he left the room, I caught the flicker of irritation on Elena's face. Good. Let them squirm. That evening, I planted the first real seed of doubt. As Elena and I sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV, I leaned in close and said, You know, I've been thinking about us. About how much we've been through together. She turned to me, her expression cautious. What do you mean? I mean, I'm glad we're here. Together. I know it's been tough, but I feel like we're stronger for it. Her smile wavered. That's really nice to hear. I reached out and took her hand, my grip firm enough to make her flinch. I just want you to know, I said, staring into her eyes, that no matter what happens, I'll always find out the truth. Her hand slipped from mine, and she laughed nervously. What are you talking about? Nothing, I said, leaning back and smiling. Just something I've been thinking about. She didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. That night, she didn't go to Mark's room. Instead, she stayed in bed next to me, tossing and turning as I lay there, pretending to sleep. It was working. Slowly but surely, I was getting under her skin. And this was only the beginning. The atmosphere in the house was changing. Elena and Mark were more careful now, avoiding prolonged conversations and keeping their distance from me. I could feel the tension in the air, like a storm gathering strength, and I thrived on it. But it wasn't enough. If I wanted to dismantle their little world completely, I had to take it a step further. It was time to make them question each other. One afternoon, when Mark was at work and Elena was out running errands, I went into Mark's room. The camera I'd planted was still recording, but today I had a new plan. I found his dresser drawer and carefully rifled through it until I came across a stash of receipts, random papers, and a few personal items. Among them was a business card for a florist downtown. Perfect. I pocketed the card and left everything else exactly as it was. Then I slipped into Elena's purse, pulling out her phone and snapping a picture of the card. I deleted the photo from my phone immediately, leaving it saved only in hers. By the time she got home, I was back in the guest room, casually scrolling through real estate listings. She called out a greeting, her voice cheerful but strained, and I played my part, waving her off with a distracted, "Hey!" She didn't know it yet, but her trust in Mark was about to crack. That evening, I brought up a story over dinner. "Crazy thing happened today," I said, pushing my food around on the plate. "I stopped by that florist downtown, you know, the one near Main Street?" Elena glanced up, curious. "Why were you at a florist?" "Thought I'd pick up some flowers for you," I said with a smile. "But guess what? They said someone had just been in there buying roses for a special someone. Said it was a guy named Mark." Mark froze mid-bite, his eyes darting to me. "Must have been a different Mark," he said quickly, his voice tight. "Maybe," I replied, my tone casual. "Small world though, isn't it?" Elena didn't say anything, but the way she shifted in her seat told me she was already questioning him. Later that night, as I pretended to sleep, I heard them arguing in hushed tones. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. Their voices were sharp, urgent, tinged with suspicion. Mark was trying to explain something, while Elena pressed him for answers. I smiled to myself, knowing I'd planted the seed of doubt. The next day, I escalated things further. While Elena was out, I wrote a note on a scrap of paper in blocky, unfamiliar handwriting. It read, "You deserve better. Let me take care of you." I slipped it into Mark's wallet, careful not to disturb anything else. Then I put his wallet back exactly where I'd found it. When Elena inevitably discovered the note, it would be the final push to shatter their trust. That evening, as Mark and Elena sat on the couch watching TV, I made an excuse to go to the store. I stayed away just long enough for her to, accidentally, find the note. When I returned, the tension in the house was palpable. Mark looked like he'd been hit by a truck, his face pale and drawn. Elena was in the kitchen, furiously scrubbing an already clean counter. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning innocence as I set the grocery bags down. "Fine," Elena snapped, not looking at me. "Why wouldn't it be?" Mark didn't say a word. He just got up and went to his room, slamming the door behind him. I leaned against the counter, watching Elena's shoulders tremble with barely contained rage. "Long day?" I asked lightly. She turned to me, her eyes flashing with anger. "Did you say something to Mark?" "Me?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "What would I have to say to him?" "I don't know," she muttered, turning back to the counter. "Forget it." But I could tell she wasn't going to forget it. Not tonight. Not ever. That night, I reviewed the footage from Mark's room. Their argument had spilled into his private space, and the camera captured every word. "Don't lie to me!" Elena hissed, holding up the note. "Who gave this to you?" "No one!" Mark shot back, his voice desperate. "I don't know where that came from." "Bullshit," she said, her voice shaking. "You've been acting weird, and now this? Do you think I'm stupid?" Mark ran his hands through his hair, pacing the room. "You're paranoid." "I didn't do anything." Elena stared at him, her eyes narrowing. "I'm starting to wonder if you're worth all this trouble." He stopped in his tracks, turning to her with a wounded expression. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer, but the silence that followed was damning. I couldn't have planned it better myself. They were unraveling, and I was just getting started. But this wasn't enough. Not yet. I wanted to push them further, to make them destroy each other. And by the time I was done, they wouldn't just regret their affair, they'd regret ever meeting me. The cracks were spreading faster than I'd hoped. Elena and Mark were avoiding each other more and more, their conversations reduced to tense whispers or bitter arguments behind closed doors. I didn't even have to try anymore. My presence alone was enough to keep them on edge. But I wasn't done. If they thought the worst was over, they were in for a surprise. One afternoon, I approached Elena while she was in the kitchen, scrolling on her phone. "I've been thinking," I began, leaning casually against the counter. She looked up, wary. "About what?" "About moving out. Maybe staying with my parents for a while." Her eyes widened slightly. "Your parents? Why?" I shrugged. "I just think we could use the space, you know? To figure things out. I mean, it's been great here, but I don't want to impose on Mark anymore." She hesitated, her expression shifting between relief and panic. "I don't think that's a good idea," she said quickly. "We need to stay together, especially after everything that's happened." "Do we?" I asked, my voice cold. Her face fell, and I let the silence hang between us for a moment before sighing. "Maybe you're right," I said, forcing a smile. "We'll stick it out here a little longer." She nodded, but her hands trembled as she picked up her coffee. She wasn't just nervous, she was scared. And that's exactly what I wanted. That night, I planted the next piece of my plan. I waited until Elena was in the shower, then slipped into Mark's room. His laptop was open on the desk, unlocked. Perfect. I quickly typed out an email to Elena, using Mark's email address, keeping the tone just right, casual but suggestive, vague but damning. Subject: "We need to talk." Body: "I've been thinking about us. Maybe this isn't working anymore. Let's figure out how to end things cleanly before it gets worse." I hit send and slipped back to the guest room before anyone noticed. The trap was set. The next morning, Elena's mood was visibly darker. She barely said a word over breakfast, her eyes darting toward Mark with a mix of anger and confusion. Mark, oblivious to the email, carried on as usual, making small talk and cracking lame jokes. It was almost funny, watching him dig his own grave without realizing it. I stayed quiet, letting the tension simmer. When Elena finally snapped, I wanted it to be spectacular. It didn't take long. That evening, I pretended to take a walk, leaving my phone behind on purpose. I circled the block, giving them just enough time to combust without me in the house. When I returned, I could hear their voices raised from outside. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Elena shouted, her voice sharp with anger. "What the hell are you talking about?" Mark shot back. "The email, Mark! You said you wanted to end this. So why don't you just admit it?" Mark's confusion was almost laughable. "What email? I didn't send you anything." "Stop lying!" Elena screamed. "You're the one who's been playing games this whole time. You've been stringing me along, making promises, and now this? I don't know what you're talking about." Mark's voice cracked, desperation creeping in. I slipped inside quietly, standing just out of sight to listen. Their arguments spilled over into the living room, their words echoing through the house. "I gave up everything for you," Elena hissed. "Do you think I wanted to be stuck here, sneaking around like some teenager? You said it was worth it. You said we were worth it. And we are," Mark said, his voice pleading. "But I didn't send you that email. You have to believe me." She laughed bitterly. "I can't believe anything you say anymore." Mark was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. I waited, savoring the moment, before stepping into the room with a casual smile. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning ignorance. They both turned to me, their faces pale and drawn. Elena quickly wiped at her eyes, trying to compose herself. "Yeah," she muttered. "Just a little disagreement." Mark said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. I nodded, pretending not to notice the tension. "Well, I'll be in the guest room if you need me." As I walked away, I could feel their eyes on me, heavy with suspicion. They were falling apart, and I was loving every second of it. Later that night, I checked the camera footage from Mark's room. Elena had stormed in after I left, confronting him again. "I'm done with this," she said, her voice cold. "I'm done with you." Mark stared at her, his jaw tight. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this was a mistake," she said, turning away. "All of it." He reached for her arm, but she pulled away. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I should have never trusted you." He stood there, stunned, as she walked out, slamming the door behind her. It was perfect. Their fragile bond had shattered, leaving them to pick up the pieces alone. But I wasn't done yet. The final act was still to come. The following days were a delicate balance. Elena and Mark barely spoke, their strained interactions reduced to the bare minimum. At first, I thought Elena might try to mend things with him, but her cold indifference made it clear she was done. Mark, on the other hand, was unraveling. He lingered at work longer than usual, avoiding being home whenever possible. When he was around, he stayed locked in his room, probably replaying every mistake that had led him to this point. It was time for the next stage. One evening, after Mark left for a late-night shift, I found Elena in the living room. She was curled up on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. Her once bright demeanor had dulled, her face drawn and weary. It was the perfect moment to strike. "Hey," I said, sitting down across from her. "You okay?" She glanced up, startled, then quickly forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired." "Doesn't seem like it," I pressed. "You've been off the last few days. Is something going on?" She hesitated, her grip tightening on her phone. For a moment, I thought she might lie, but then she sighed and set the phone down. "It's nothing. Just a lot on my mind." "You can talk to me, you know," I said, leaning forward. "We're in this together." Her expression softened, and for a second, I almost believed she might open up. But then she shook her head. "It's complicated." "More complicated than us losing our house?" I asked gently. "Come on, Elena. I know something's been bothering you. You can trust me." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I feel like everything's falling apart." "You're not alone," I said, my voice steady. Whatever it is, we can face it together. Her shoulders slumped, and she buried her face in her hands. I don't deserve you, she mumbled. I've made so many mistakes. I didn't reply, letting the silence stretch between us. Finally, she looked up, her eyes red and glistening. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. For everything. What do you mean? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, then shook her head. I can't. I leaned back, my expression hardening. Elena, if there's something you need to tell me, now's the time. Because if you're hiding something, I'll find out. Her face paled, and she opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the sound of the front door opening made us both freeze. Mark stepped inside, his face pinched and pale. He stopped when he saw us, his eyes narrowing. What's going on? He asked, his voice tense. Nothing, Elena said quickly, standing up. I was just talking about mistakes. I cut in, my gaze locked on Mark. Big ones. Mark's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the room was heavy with unspoken accusations. Elena looked between us, her face pale and panicked. I'm going to bed, she said abruptly, brushing past both of us without another word. Mark waited until her footsteps disappeared upstairs before turning to me. What was that about? I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral. Just trying to figure out where we all stand. What's that supposed to mean? He snapped. You tell me, I said, standing up and stepping closer. You've been acting shady for weeks. I think we both know why. Mark's face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But then he shook his head, his lips curling into a bitter smile. You don't know anything. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. Don't I? Mark flinched, his confidence crumbling. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. Later that night, I slipped into the living room and retrieved a stack of printed photos from a folder I'd hidden in the bookshelf. They were stills from the footage I'd collected, Elena and Mark in his bed, their stolen moments frozen in time. I left the photos on the kitchen table, neatly arranged for maximum impact. Then I went to bed, knowing the storm would break by morning. I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I was woken by the sound of shouting. I slipped out of bed and lingered at the top of the stairs, listening as the chaos unfolded below. What the hell is this? Mark's voice boomed, furious and panicked. You tell me! Elena shouted back. You said he didn't know. You said we were careful. Mark stammered, his anger giving way to desperation. I don't know how he got these. Their voices overlapped, accusations flying back and forth as their fragile alliance shattered completely. When I finally made my way downstairs, they both turned to me, their faces pale and stricken. Morning, I said casually, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Something wrong? You, Mark began, but his words faltered. You did this, didn't you? I took a slow sip, savoring the moment. Did what? These photos! Elena screamed, shoving them toward me. How did you? How long have you? I set the mug down, meeting her gaze with icy calm. Long enough. The silence that followed was deafening. The air in the kitchen was suffocating, the silence crackling with tension. Elena and Mark stared at me, their faces pale and drawn, their anger barely masking the panic beneath. You had no right! Elena finally spat, her voice trembling. She held up one of the photos, her hand shaking. This is insane! How could you do this? I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. How could I do this? You're asking the wrong question, Elena. The real question is, how could you? Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mark, meanwhile, looked like a caged animal, his eyes darting toward the door as if he was contemplating making a run for it. This isn't what you think, Mark stammered. We didn't mean for. Didn't mean for what? I interrupted, my voice razor sharp. Didn't mean to destroy my marriage? Didn't mean to spit on everything we built together? Or didn't mean to get caught? Mark's face twisted into a grimace, but he didn't respond. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. You think you're the victim here? I said, taking a step closer. Both of you lied to me, betrayed me, treated me like a fool. And now that it's all out in the open, you want me to feel guilty? Not gonna happen. Elena wiped her face, her voice breaking. We made a mistake, okay? I know we messed up, but this is cruel, even for you. I laughed, a sound so cold it seemed to freeze the room. Cruel? You have no idea what cruel looks like. Mark tried to leave first. He muttered something about needing air and made a beeline for the front door, but I stepped into his path. You're not going anywhere, I said, my tone low and menacing. Get out of my way, Mark hissed, his shoulders squaring up like he thought he could intimidate me. Or what? I asked, taking a deliberate step closer. You think you can scare me, Mark? You think you can fight your way out of this? Go ahead. Try. Mark's bravado crumbled almost instantly. He backed down, retreating to the far side of the kitchen with his hands raised. Fine, he muttered. I'll stay. Good, I said, turning my attention back to Elena. She had crumpled into a chair, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I didn't know if she was crying or hyperventilating, but either way, it didn't matter. Elena, I said, my voice cold and calm. Look at me. She didn't move. I said look at me. I repeated, louder this time. Finally, she lifted her head, her tear-streaked face a mixture of guilt and defiance. What do you want from me? She whispered. I want the truth, I said. No more lies. No more excuses. I want you to admit what you've done. I already did, she snapped. I made a mistake. Is that what you want to hear? That I'm the worst person in the world? Fine. I'm a terrible wife, a terrible person. Are you happy now? I shook my head. Not even close. I let the silence hang between us for a moment, then pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times, bringing up the folder of recordings and photos I'd collected. See, here's the thing, I said, holding up the phone. It's not just about what you've done to me. It's about what you've done to yourselves. This, I gestured to the phone, is proof. Proof that you're both liars, cheaters, and cowards. Proof that will destroy everything you care about. Mark's eyes widened, and he took a step forward. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fallout, I said, meeting his gaze. Your job, your reputation, your friendships, gone. And you, Elena? Your family, your friends, your life as you know it, it's over. All it takes is one click, and the whole world will see you for who you really are. Elena's face crumpled, but Mark's expression hardened. You wouldn't, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Wouldn't I? I asked, my thumb hovering over the screen. Elena lunged forward, grabbing my arm. Please don't, she begged, her voice breaking. Please, I'm sorry. I'll do anything, just don't do this. Her desperation was almost satisfying, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I shook her off, stepping back and pocketing the phone. You'll do anything? I asked, my tone mocking. Funny, that's what I used to believe. But now, I don't believe a damn word you say. Elena collapsed into the chair, sobbing openly. Mark stood frozen, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. I'll give you both one chance, I said, my voice like ice. Leave. Tonight. I don't care where you go, but if you're still here by morning, this goes public. You can't be serious, Mark said, his voice shaking. Try me, I replied, my gaze unwavering. Neither of them moved at first, but as the weight of my ultimatum sank in, they began to scramble. Elena packed in a daze, her movements frantic and disjointed. Mark muttered curses under his breath as he grabbed his things, shooting me venomous glares every chance he got. By the time they left, the house was silent again. I stood in the empty kitchen, my heart pounding, the adrenaline coursing through me like fire. I'd won. But the victory felt hollow. When the doors slammed shut behind Elena and Mark, The silence was deafening. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the space they just vacated, the echo of their departure ringing in my ears. The house felt emptier than it had ever been, even before the fire. But for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. I should have felt triumphant. I had taken control, flipped the narrative, and forced them out of my life. But as I sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of everything hit me all at once. The anger that had kept me moving forward, the burning sense of purpose, it all evaporated, leaving behind an ache I couldn't shake. The first few days were surreal. I didn't hear from Elena or Mark, and I didn't care to check where they had gone. The folder of evidence sat untouched on my phone, its presence both a comfort and a reminder of how far I'd gone. At night, the house was too quiet. Every creak, every whisper of wind felt amplified in the empty rooms. I found myself wandering through the halls, replaying conversations, moments, and memories that now felt tainted. The guest room, where I'd slept for weeks, still smelled faintly of her perfume. I moved to the couch instead. Then, on the fourth day, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Elena. Subject: Please. Body: Ryan, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. I know I don't deserve forgiveness or even a response, but I need you to know how sorry I am. What I did was unforgivable. I don't expect us to ever go back to the way things were, but please believe me when I say I loved you. I still do. I got lost. I don't know who I am anymore, and I hate the person I've become. If you don't want to talk, I understand. But I needed to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to process the mix of emotions it stirred. Part of me wanted to delete it without replying. Another part wanted to write back, to let her know just how deeply she'd hurt me. In the end, I didn't respond at all. I couldn't. The following week, I got another email, this time from Mark. Subject: For what it's worth. Body: Ryan, I know I screwed up. I know there's no excuse for what I did, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I don't even know how it got this far. You were my friend, and I betrayed you. I'll regret it for the rest of my life. If you ever want to talk, I'll listen. But if not, I get it. I'm sorry, man. I stared at the screen, my anger flaring all over again. He didn't mean for it to happen? What a pathetic excuse. I slammed the laptop shut and walked away, the email unanswered. Time passed slowly. The days blurred together as I tried to rebuild some sense of normalcy. I threw myself into work, focusing on anything that kept me from dwelling on the past. But the nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. One evening, as I sat in the empty living room, I scrolled through the folder of evidence on my phone. The photos, the recordings, it was all still there, untouched since the day I'd confronted them. My finger hovered over the delete button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. I told myself it was for closure, for a sense of control. But deep down, I knew it was something darker. A safety net. A weapon, just in case. Weeks later, I got a call from a mutual friend. He'd run into Elena at a grocery store in another town. She looked different, he said, tired, drawn, not at all like the woman we remembered. She had mentioned she was staying with her sister and looking for a fresh start. He didn't ask about Mark, and neither did I. One day, while cleaning out the guest room, I found a notebook Elena had left behind. It was filled with lists, groceries, to-do items, scribbled notes about insurance claims. But on the last page, there was something different. A paragraph written in her handwriting, messy and hurried. I ruined everything. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. Maybe this is what I deserve. Maybe Ryan will finally be free of me. Maybe that's the only good thing to come from all of this. I stared at the words, my throat tightening. For the first time, I felt a pang of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks, pity. But I shoved it down. That night I sat in the dark, the notebook on the table in front of me. I thought about everything I'd lost, my home, my marriage, the life I thought I'd built. It was all gone, reduced to ashes, just like the house. But as I stared at the notebook, a realization crept in. I hadn't just lost something. I'd burned it down myself. The decision to let it all go didn't come in a grand, life-affirming moment. It crept up on me in the middle of a sleepless night, somewhere between the lingering bitterness and the crushing silence of the empty house. The notebook was still on the table, Elena's messy scrawl staring back at me. Her words, written in guilt and self-loathing, had stuck in my mind all day. I hated her for what she'd done, hated Mark even more, but now, I hated myself too. The man I had become was as much a stranger as the woman I had married. I had spent so much time plotting their downfall, orchestrating their misery, that I'd let them take everything from me, even my own sense of self. It was time to end it. Not for them, but for me. The first thing I did was delete the folder. Every photo, every recording, every shred of evidence, I wiped it clean. Watching it disappear from my phone felt like shedding a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying. For weeks, I told myself I needed it for closure. But closure wasn't about holding on to proof. It was about letting go. The next day, I called a realtor. I told her I wanted to sell what was left of the house and move somewhere new, somewhere far away from the memories. She was sympathetic, telling me how brave it was to start fresh after a tragedy. I didn't correct her. She didn't need to know the full story. In the weeks that followed, I stayed focused on the future. Packing up what little I had left, making arrangements to leave the city where my life had come undone. But as much as I tried to look forward, there were still lingering shadows from the past. Elena reached out again, this time with a voicemail. Her voice was softer, less frantic than before, but still tinged with regret. "Ryan, I just wanted to say thank you. For not ruining my life the way I ruined yours. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I hope someday you can move on. I hope we both can." I deleted the message without responding. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. But I didn't feel the anger anymore, and that was enough. A few weeks later, I heard from that same mutual friend who had spotted Elena. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Mark had left town. Apparently, things between him and Elena had fallen apart shortly after they left my house. "Guess karma caught up to him," the friend joked. I didn't laugh. On my last night in the house, I sat in the living room, surrounded by boxes. The furniture was gone, the walls bare, the emptiness echoing louder than ever. I thought about all the things I'd leave behind, the good, the bad, and everything in between. It wasn't a clean slate, but it was as close as I'd ever get. Before I went to bed, I wrote one final note. Not for Elena, not for Mark, but for myself. They took everything. But I survived. And that's enough. The next morning, I locked the door behind me and drove away without looking back. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The end. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.